The winter of 1878 had teeth, and it had been biting down on Caldwell Creek, Kansas, for so long that Belle Baker had started to forget what warmth felt like against her skin. She stood at the frost-laced window of the homestead her late husband Thomas had built with his own hands 3 years prior, pressing her fingertips to the cold glass and watching the gray sky refuse to break. The land stretched out before her in every direction, flat and white and indifferent, the kind of landscape that made a person feel very small and very alone all at once. The cottonwood trees along the creek bank stood stripped bare, their skeletal branches trembling in the wind like old men who had given up trying to stand straight. The barn needed a new beam on the east wall. The larder was down to salt pork, dried beans, and a half sack of cornmeal that she had been rationing with a precision that would have impressed a banker. And the wood pile, which Thomas had always kept stacked high enough to see over, was now a sad and shrinking collection of logs that she estimated would last her another 2 weeks. Maybe 3, if she was careful. Maybe 2, if this cold kept pressing down the way it had been pressing since November. Belle Baker was 26 years old, a widow going on 8 months, and she was beginning to understand something about hope that nobody had ever told her plainly. Hope was not a feeling that arrived on its own and stayed. It was something you had to work at, something you had to chop like firewood and stack and guard against the weather. And she was running low on the labor for it. She turned from the window and went to the small iron stove in the corner of the single large room that served as kitchen and sitting room both. She fed it 2 small logs and watched the flames lick up through the gaps, grateful for the heat, even as she counted what remained outside. Her daughter Clara, who was 4 years old and possessed of the kind of resilience that only very young children and very old dogs ever manage to hold onto, was asleep on the narrow cot in the back of the room with a quilt pulled up to her chin. Clara had her father's dark hair and her mother's stubborn chin, and she had not once complained about the cold or the thin meals or the fact that her papa was not coming back. That stoicism was either a gift or a mercy, and Belle could not decide which. The nearest town was Caldwell itself, 4 miles east, and Belle had made the trip twice in the past month. Once to sell the last of Thomas's good horse tack to Mr. Abernathy at the general store, and once to inquire at the post office whether there had been any response to the letter she had written to her brother in Missouri. There had been no response. Her brother Edwin was kind but stretched thin himself, with a wife, 3 children, and a farm that was fighting the same hard winter. She had not written again. The homestead had been granted to Thomas under the Homestead Act of 1862, 160 acres of Kansas grassland that had been Thomas's great ambition and was now Belle's great burden. She did not resent the land. She had loved it once, when Thomas was beside her and the summers had been green, and the cattle had been fat, and the 2 of them had stood on the porch in the evenings talking about what they would build. But Thomas had been thrown from his horse in April, had lingered for 3 days in a fever she could not break, and had gone quietly on the 4th morning while she held his hand and Clara slept unknowing in the corner. The cattle had been sold to pay the doctor who came too late and the pastor who came on time. The horse had been sold after. The mule had broken its leg in September, and she had done what needed to be done with Thomas's rifle, which was the hardest thing she had ever done with her hands. She was not a woman who fell easily into self-pity. Her mother had raised her with a practical streak that ran deep as a well, and she used it now the way she used every other tool she had. She mended her own clothing. She repaired the chicken coop with boards she pried from an old fence post. She kept the fire going. She kept Clara fed and warm and told her stories at night about places with flowers and sunshine, and Clara would say, "Tell me about the yellow flowers again, Mama," and Belle would tell her about yellow flowers until the child's eyes closed. But the wood pile was shrinking, and the larder was shrinking, and the sky outside showed no intention of warming any time soon. It was on a Thursday morning in the first week of February that Belle heard it. She was outside splitting what remained of the wood pile, her breath coming in white clouds, her arms aching from the work, when she heard the sound of wagon wheels on the frozen road. Not the quick rattle of a rider or the light creak of a buggy, but the heavy, deliberate roll of a loaded wagon with a team pulling hard. She straightened and shielded her eyes against the pale winter light. The wagon was big. It was a freight wagon of the kind used to haul goods between towns, drawn by two large draft horses, chestnuts with frosted breath and heavy hooves that cracked the ice in the ruts of the road with each step. The man driving it sat high on the seat, with a coat so thick he looked like a bear that had learned to hold reins. He had a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind and a scarf wrapped up over his chin, and he was heading up the road that ran past the homestead toward nowhere in particular, since the road petered out about a mile north of Belle's property line. She watched him come with the axe still in her hand, not alarmed but curious. Nobody came up this road in February without a reason. Nobody came up this road much at all, since the homesteads to the north had been abandoned the previous autumn, their owners having made the sensible decision to go somewhere that did not actively try to kill them. The wagon slowed as it approached the gate post at the edge of her property, and the man pulled the horses to a stop and looked at her from under the brim of his hat. He had a broad, weathered face, honest in the way that outdoor faces sometimes got, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke more of squinting into sun and wind than of hardship. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps 32, with brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and gray eyes that were assessing her the way a careful man assessed an unfamiliar situation. He was not handsome in the conventional way that the dime novels described handsome, but he had the kind of face that you wanted to keep looking at, which Belle thought was probably worth more. "Morning," he said. His voice was deep and measured, carrying easily across the wind. "Morning," she replied. He looked at the axe in her hand, then at the remaining wood pile, then at the homestead behind her, and then back at her. He did this without being rude about it, in the way of a man who noticed things and did not pretend otherwise. "Road wash out north of here?" he asked. "Not that I know of," she said, "but I haven't been up that way in a while. Nobody has." The Hendersons and the Calhoun family both pulled out in October. He nodded as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "That would explain why my information was wrong," he said. He reached under the seat and pulled out a folded piece of paper that was clearly a letter or a manifest of some kind, looked at it, and then looked at the land around him with an expression that was somewhere between resigned and mildly amused. "I was hired to deliver to 3 homesteads up this road. Got all the way from Wichita with a full load." "You came from Wichita in this weather," Belle said, not hiding her surprise. "Left 5 days ago," he said. "Weather was better when I started." He paused. "My name is Walter Keller. I run freight out of Wichita." "Belle Baker," she said. "This is my homestead." He tipped his hat to her, which was the kind of courteous gesture that a man did without thinking when he had been raised properly. "Ma'am, I apologize for pulling up unannounced." "You're not on my property yet," she said. "No apology needed." There was a brief silence in which the wind moved between them and the horses shifted and stamped their heavy feet. Walter Keller looked at the wagon behind him and then back at her. He seemed to be deciding something. "I've got a problem," he said, with the candor of a man who didn't see the use in dancing around things. "I've got a wagon load of goods that were purchased and paid for by people who are no longer here to receive them. Firewood mostly. Cut cord wood, 4 loads worth. Some provisions. Flour, salt, lamp oil. There's a crate of canned goods from back east which somebody special ordered and paid a good deal for." He paused. "If I take it back to Wichita, it's going to cost me more in time and feed for the horses than the haul was worth to begin with. The people who ordered it aren't coming back for it. I've been sitting here on this road for the past 5 minutes thinking about my options." Belle was quiet for a moment. She looked at the wagon. She looked at the man. She was a practical woman and she could do arithmetic, and she was not too proud to understand what was being laid out before her. "How much of it is firewood?" she asked. "About half the load," he said. "Maybe a little more." She felt something shift in her chest. Not the easy, generous feeling of being rescued which she would have resented. Something more complicated than that. The feeling of winter which had been so certain in its dominion over her, suddenly becoming less certain. Like a wall that had seemed permanent developing a crack. "I can't pay you for it," she said directly. "I want to be plain about that before we go any further." "I didn't ask you to," he said, equally plain. "I don't take charity," she said, and there was iron in it. He thought about this for a moment with the careful respect of a man who took a person at their word. "The goods are paid for," he said, "by people who don't need them. If I take them back to Wichita, they spoil or get sold for pennies at auction. If I leave them here, they go to use. That's not charity. That's just the most sensible use of a difficult situation." He paused. "I'd appreciate the use of your barn tonight if it's not too much to ask. The horses need rest and I need to figure out my route back. I can be gone by morning." Belle Baker stood in the cold with the axe in her hand and the wind pulling at her hair, which had come loose from its pins, and she looked at this man on his big freight wagon with his cold-reddened face and his matter-of-fact manner, and she made her decision the way she made all her decisions, which was quickly and without a great deal of ceremony. "You can use the barn," she said, "and I'll feed you supper." She thought she saw something in his gray eyes shift, not quite a smile but the shadow of one. "That's generous of you," he said. "It's practical," she said. "A fed man makes better decisions than a hungry one." He laughed at that, a real laugh, brief and surprised, and she felt the sound of it do something unexpected to the cold air between them. She turned before he could see whatever expression might have crossed her face and walked toward the barn gate to swing it open for him. It took the better part of 2 hours to unload what Walter Keller decided to leave at the homestead. He worked with an efficient economy of motion that she recognized as the hallmark of a man who spent his days moving heavy things and had long since figured out how to do it without wasting effort. He stacked the cord wood against the side of the barn in a formation that she had not seen before, interlocked in a pattern that he explained without being asked, would shed water better and stay drier than a straight stack. He carried the sacks of flour and the cans of lamp oil into the house himself, setting them where she directed without comment. The crate of canned goods turned out to contain tomatoes, peaches, and a variety of vegetables in tin, and when he set it on the table, Clara appeared from the back room where she had been watching with large, solemn eyes and stared at the crate with an expression of profound interest. "What's in there?" Clara asked. "Peaches," Walter said. He looked at the little girl with a directness that children always seem to respond to, the kind of look that took them seriously. "You ever had canned peaches?" Clara shook her head. "They're not as good as the fresh kind," he said, "but in February they're about the best thing there is." Clara looked at her mother. Belle nodded slightly. Clara looked back at Walter with an expression that suggested she was reserving judgment but was open to being convinced. When the wagon was partially unloaded, and the horses were settled in the barn with water and oats from the small supply Belle had been keeping for a horse she no longer owned, Walter came back to the house and removed his coat and his hat and stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the warmth of the room reach him. Without the bulk of the coat, he was a tall man, lean through the shoulders and strong in the way of physical work rather than deliberate effort, with hands that were scarred and calloused in the way of ropes and heavy loads. He looked around the room with that same careful noticing quality that she had observed outside, taking in the cast-iron stove, the mended curtains, the shelf of books beside the window, the child's drawings pinned to the wall above the cot. "Nice place," he said, and he meant it. "It was nicer when there were 2 of us working it," she said without self-pity, just fact. He nodded once, acknowledging it without pressing on it. "Your husband, Thomas, he died last April." "I'm sorry," he said. It was not the elaborate sympathy that some people felt obligated to perform. It was direct and genuine, and then it was done, which she respected more than she expected to. She made corn bread and heated the salt pork and opened one of the cans of tomatoes, and made something that was more than she had cooked in a while. And the three of them sat at the table together in a way that was slightly awkward for the first few minutes, and then gradually less so. Walter ate with the appetite of a man who had been on the road for 5 days in February, and he was polite about it, not wolf-like, but honest. Clara watched him steadily from across the table with the evaluating gaze of a 4-year-old who had not seen a man at supper in many months. "Do you have a horse?" Clara asked him suddenly. "2 draft horses," he said, "Chester and Earl. Which one is which?" "Chester is the bigger one. Earl is the one that makes a noise when he eats." Clara considered this. "Our mule made a noise," she said. "His name was Jeremiah." "Good name for a mule," Walter said. "Mama had to shoot him," Clara said with the matter-of-fact severity of a child reporting a weather event. There was a brief silence. Belle kept her eyes on her food. "That's a hard thing to have to do," Walter said quietly. "Mama cried," Clara said, not unkindly. "But she said it was the right thing because his leg was broken and he was hurting." "Your mama sounds like she makes good decisions," Walter said. Clara nodded seriously. "She does mostly. Sometimes she burns the corn bread." Belle looked up then and found Walter looking at her with that not quite a smile again. And this time she didn't look away fast enough. And for a moment they were both just 2 people at a table in the middle of a Kansas winter, sharing an expression that was warmer than the room. "Sometimes I do burn the corn bread," she agreed. After Clara was asleep, Belle sat at the table with a tin cup of coffee and Walter sat across from her, and the fire in the stove was doing its work steadily against the cold outside. He had offered twice to go out to the barn and sleep in the wagon, and she had told him twice that the temperature was dropping, and there was a perfectly good floor in here, and he had ultimately accepted a blanket and the floor without further argument. They talked, not in the careful, performative way of strangers who are trying to make an impression, but in the gradual, exploratory way of 2 people who are finding out if they make sense to each other. He was from Illinois originally, he told her, had come west with his father at 17, when the father had gotten it into his head to try cattle ranching in Nebraska. The ranching had not worked out, but the West had suited Walter, and he had stayed when his father eventually went back to Illinois. He had worked cattle drives for 3 years, then found the freight work more reliable and less likely to kill him, and had been running routes out of Wichita for the past 4 years. "Do you like it?" she asked. "The freight work?" He thought about this with genuine consideration. "I like being useful," he said, "and I like moving. I've never been much good at staying in one place." He paused, "although I think that's less a preference and more just a habit I got into." She told him about Thomas, about coming to Kansas from Ohio as a new bride, about the first summer which had been hard and hot and full of uncertainty, and then about finding her love for the land somewhere in that difficulty. About the summer 2 years ago when the wheat had come in so well that they had talked all autumn about building a second room onto the house. She told him about April, without drama, just the facts of it, and he listened without interrupting, which was the right thing to do. "What are you going to do?" he asked, not unkindly, practically. "Stay," she said immediately. He looked at her. "I know what everyone thinks," she said. "I know it doesn't make obvious sense. But this is my land. Thomas and I built this house. Clara was born here. I'm not going to let one bad winter drive me off something I've worked for." She held his gaze steadily. "The winter won't last forever. It never does." Walter Keller looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that were doing something she couldn't quite read, and then he looked down at his coffee and said, "No, it never does." In the morning he was up before her, which she discovered when she came from the back room where she had eventually moved Clara to give the child more warmth, and found the fire already burning strong and a sound from outside that turned out to be Walter splitting wood. Not the remaining logs from her dwindling pile, but the cordwood he had unloaded, cutting some of it to stove lengths. He was working with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man who found the work meditative rather than punishing, and when she appeared in the doorway with a shawl over her shoulders he glanced over but kept splitting. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "Hand me that wedge." She handed him the iron wedge from the pile of tools by the door and watched him work for a moment. The morning was clear and very cold, the kind of cold that polished the sky to a hard, pale blue and made every sound ring clearly. The horses were moving in the barn, she could hear them. "You'll be on your way today?" she asked. She didn't mean it as a question about when he was leaving exactly. It came out sounding more like an inquiry about what his plans were, which was a different thing. He looked at her over the log he had just set on the block. "The east beam on your barn," he said. "It's split." "I know," she said. "I don't have the timber to fix it." "I've got some boards in the back of the wagon," he said. "Extras from a delivery I made in Hutchinson. They might do the job." She was quiet for a moment. "Walter," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and they both noticed it. "I can't keep taking from you." He set the axe down and looked at her directly. "I'm not going anywhere today. The road north is going to be rough with ice, and I'd rather wait till midday when it softens a little before I head back. I've got time in the morning, and I've got boards, and I've got 2 hands. The barn beam seems like the obvious use of all 3. He picked the axe back up. "I'm not doing it out of pity if that's what you're worried about." "What are you doing it out of?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness she was starting to expect from him. "Because it needs doing and I can do it," he said. "And because you're not the kind of woman who makes it comfortable to watch something that needs doing go undone." She looked at him for a moment and then turned and went back inside to make coffee, and he went back to splitting wood, and Clara appeared a few minutes later in the doorway in her nightgown to watch him with undisguised fascination. He fixed the barn beam. It took most of the morning, with Belle holding boards while he drove nails, a collaboration that developed its own quiet rhythm without discussion. Clara sat on a hay bale and offered unsolicited opinions about the quality of the work. Walter received these opinions with gravity and occasionally adjusted his approach accordingly, which made Clara feel important and made Belle feel something she was not entirely ready to examine. By midday the beam was fixed. The barn was sturdier than it had been in months, and there was enough wood stacked against the house wall to last 6 weeks at least. Walter loaded the remaining goods back onto the wagon, taking the empty crate and the things that hadn't been part of the abandoned deliveries. He harnessed Chester and Earl in the barn and led them out into the midday light, which had taken on the slightly warmer quality that a February sun sometimes managed for an hour or 2 before giving up. He stood by the wagon with his hat in his hands for a moment, which was the first time she had seen him uncertain about something. "My route brings me through Caldwell every 3 weeks or so," he said. "The road past your place isn't on the route, but it's not far off it." Belle stood with her arms crossed against the cold, looking at him steadily. "I know where Caldwell is," she said. "I'm just saying," he said, and put his hat on. "I'll be here," she said. He nodded. He climbed up onto the wagon seat and took the reins, and Chester and Earl moved forward with the slow power of large animals who knew their work. Belle watched the wagon go down the road, the bare cottonwoods on either side throwing thin shadows across the frozen ground. Clara came and stood beside her and tucked herself against Belle's hip. "Is he coming back?" Clara asked. "He says his route comes through Caldwell," Belle said. "That's not what I asked," Clara said, with the logical precision of a child who was paying close attention. Belle looked down at her daughter. "I don't know," she said honestly. Clara thought about this. "I hope he does," she said. "He fixed the barn and he knew about Chester and Earl's names." "Those are good reasons," Belle agreed. She went back inside and the house felt larger than it had the night before, which was a strange thing for a house to become after having an extra person in it. Usually it worked the other way. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the stacked provisions on the shelf, the full wood pile outside, the morning's work in the barn already settling into normalcy. She thought about what Walter Keller had said when she asked what he was doing it out of. "Because it needs doing and I can do it." She had known men who talked more and did less, and men who talked less and did more. Walter appeared to be thoroughly in the second category. She told herself not to make too much of a man who had been stranded on her road by a bad delivery route, and the decency of his own nature. She told herself this several times over the following 2 days as she worked through the provisions and kept the new fire going strong and felt, for the first time since November, something that was not exactly hope in the large sense, but was at least the foundation of it. Something solid to stand on. The following 3 weeks were busy in the way that hard winters were always busy when you were alone on a homestead, which was to say busy with the continuous, grinding work of simply maintaining the conditions necessary for survival. But with the wood and the provisions that Walter had left, the character of that work changed from desperate to merely demanding. She was not counting logs anymore. She was not measuring out flour by the spoonful. She repaired the chicken coop again, more thoroughly this time, and in doing so found that 3 of her 4 remaining chickens had survived the cold snaps in better condition than she had expected. She began to think in longer terms than the next 2 weeks. She began to think about the spring. She thought about Walter Keller too, though she tried to be orderly about it, which was to say she tried to think about him only when she had no more practical matters requiring her attention, which meant she thought about him at night when Clara was asleep, and the fire was burning, and the house was as quiet as Kansas ever got. She thought about the way he had accepted Clara's commentary on his carpentry, with complete seriousness. She thought about how he had said she was not the kind of woman who made it comfortable to watch something that needed doing go undone, which was possibly the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about her. She thought about the not-quite smile and the gray eyes and the way he held himself, which was the way of a man who was at home in his own body, because he used it honestly. She was not fool enough to think that a man passing through once on a delayed freight route amounted to anything. She was 26 years old, not 16, and she had loved Thomas Baker with a steadiness and depth that had not worn off with his death the way she had been half afraid it would. She was not looking for a replacement for what she'd had. She was not looking for anyone at all, as far as she could determine the contents of her own heart. But she was not going to pretend that Walter Keller's arrival on her road had not made the remaining winter feel different. He came back in 22 days. Not 3 weeks exactly, but close enough that she was not quite surprised when she heard the wagon on the road, though she was outside in the yard feeding the chickens, and she stopped with the feed bucket in her hand and watched the big freight wagon coming up the road with something in her chest that she chose not to name. He pulled up at the gate as he had before and looked down at her from the high seat. The weather had shifted marginally, the worst of the cold pulling back 2 days prior, and today the sky was a washed-out blue with actual sunshine in it, thin but present. "Belle Baker," he said. "Walter Keller," she said. "Barn beam holding up. Strong as a new one," she said. He climbed down from the wagon without being invited, which was either presumptuous or comfortable depending on how you felt about it, and she found she felt it was comfortable, which told her something. He tied the horses to the gate post and came through with a bundle under his arm that turned out to be, when he unwrapped the canvas around it, a collection of seed packets. Corn, beans, squash, and what turned out to be a variety of sunflower she had not seen before. "Picked these up in Wichita," he said. "Figured you'd be thinking about planting season." She looked at the packets and then at him. "You figured right," she said. "The sunflowers are from a woman in Wichita who grows them," he said. "She said they do well in Kansas soil. I don't know much about gardening, but she seemed to know what she was talking about." Belle turned one of the sunflower packets over in her hands. The drawing on the front showed a tall, exuberant flower with a face like a small sun, the kind of thing that Clara would probably love. "How much do I owe you for these?" "They were a gift from Mrs. Alderman," he said. "She gives them to anyone heading out to the farms. She said the world needs more sunflowers, and she's right about that." Belle looked up at him. "And what about you? What are you doing out this way? Your route goes through Caldwell, not past it." "I had some time," he said, without elaborating. They both knew this was not a full answer, and both of them allowed it to stand. Clara appeared in the doorway of the house, saw Walter, and ran across the yard with a speed that suggested she had been watching for him from the window. She skidded to a stop in front of him and looked up. "Did you bring Chester and Earl?" she demanded. "They're at the gate," he said. She looked at the gate, saw the two large draft horses standing patiently, and her face broke into an expression of such pure satisfaction that Belle had to look away for a moment. He stayed for the afternoon. He helped her identify which fence posts needed replacing before the spring ground thaw made them lean, marking them with strips of cloth. He had dinner with them again, and this time Clara showed him the drawings she had made on the wall above her cot, and explained each one in detail while Walter sat on the edge of the cot and listened with the full attention of a man who had no experience with children but was compensating entirely through respect. Belle stood in the doorway and watched this, holding a dish she had been meaning to dry for the past 5 minutes. After Clara was in bed, they sat at the table again with coffee, and the conversation came more easily this time, the careful steps of the first visit replaced by something more like stride. He told her about a delivery gone wrong in November, a load of cast iron stoves for a hardware store in Dodge City that had slid off the wagon in a river crossing and had to be hauled back up by hand, a process that had taken 4 hours and left him bruised from shoulder to hip. She laughed at the way he told it, the dry understatement of a man recounting a disaster with the humor that sufficient time provides. She told him about the summer she had tried to keep bees and had failed comprehensively, and had spent 3 days with a face so swollen from stings that Thomas had not been able to look at her without laughing, which had made her both furious and eventually amused. Walter laughed at that too, a genuine warm sound, and she noticed how much she liked the sound of it in her house. "You laugh more than you let on," she said. He considered this. "I suppose I don't often have occasion to," he said. "That's a lonely kind of life," she said. He met her eyes. "It has been," he said. There was something in the directness of it that made the evening feel suddenly quieter, the way a room feels quieter when something important has been said. Belle looked down at her coffee. "The nights are the hardest," she said, and she was not sure herself whether she was still talking about his loneliness or her own. "Not because it's cold. Because it's quiet in a way that used to be full." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke it was carefully, the way a man speaks when he is trying to say something true without saying too much of it. "I think about stopping somewhere," he said. "More lately than before. I think about it differently than I used to." She looked at him. He was looking at the table, turning his coffee cup slowly in both hands the way men do when they are thinking. "You don't have to explain it," she said. "No," he agreed. "I know." He slept on the floor again and was gone before full dawn, but he left the seed packets on the table and a note, written in a clear, deliberate hand that suggested a man who did not write often but wrote well when he did. The note said that he was planning to be through Caldwell again in 3 weeks and would stop in if she didn't object. If she would prefer he didn't, she could leave a piece of cloth tied to the gate post and he would respect that. She read the note 3 times. She did not tie any cloth to the gate post. She put the note in the small wooden box where she kept Thomas's letters and her mother's brooch and Clara's first shoe, which she realized, after she had done it, said something about where Walter Keller had arrived in her estimation. He came back in 3 weeks, and then 3 weeks after that, and by March the pattern of his visits had become something she arranged her calendar around without discussing it with anyone. Each time he came, he brought something practical, not lavish, because he understood her well enough by then to know that anything too generous would sit wrong with her. Nails, a new hinge for the cellar door, a newspaper from Wichita because he had mentioned she missed reading the news and she had mentioned it only once, a small tin of candy that he claimed was left over from a delivery, which she suspected was not true but accepted gracefully, because it made Clara unreservedly happy. He worked when he visited. Not because she asked him to, but because there was always work to be done and he was there and capable, and she had come to understand that this was how Walter Keller expressed care, through the application of skill and effort to things that needed fixing. She began to notice that she did the same thing and that they did it well together. They would assess a problem, divide the work naturally based on what each of them was better at, accomplish it without a great deal of discussion, and then stand back and look at the result with the shared satisfaction of two people who have built something. The winter began to let go in March, grudgingly at first, the way a difficult winter always did, offering a warm day and then taking it back, offering another and pulling it back again, but gradually and then all at once losing its authority over the land. The snow retreated from the open places, and then from the shadows, and then from the north faces of things. And the creek, which had been locked under ice since December, came alive with a sound that Belle had been waiting for without quite knowing how much she was waiting for it until she heard it. She was outside with Clara when the ice broke on the creek, a low rushing sound carried on the March wind, and Clara heard it first and grabbed Belle's hand and said, "Mama, the water," and Belle felt something move through her that she had no name for, a combination of relief and gladness and the particular feeling of having survived something and found oneself on the other side of it. Walter came on a Saturday in late March and found Belle in the garden, which was still more mud than earth but was being turned over with a spade in preparation for the seeds she was going to plant as soon as the last frost passed. He came through the gate and stood watching her for a moment before she heard him, and when she looked up he was smiling at her. Not the not-quite smile she had come to know, but a real one, full and easy, and it changed his face in a way that made her breath catch. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You look like you belong here." She looked around at her muddy yard and her uneven garden plot and her slightly listing fence line, and then back at him. "I do belong here," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." He came to sit beside her on the porch steps while she scraped the mud off her boots, and the afternoon light was doing what March light did in Kansas when it decided to try, which was to turn everything a color that was between gold and green and made the world look as if it was making a promise. Clara was in the yard chasing one of the chickens with a stick, not maliciously but in the way of a child who needed to be in motion. "I've been thinking," Walter said. She waited. "I've been thinking about the route," he said. "I've been thinking that Caldwell is a reasonable hub. That a man could run freight out of Caldwell instead of Wichita and cover the same territory with a shorter home base." He was looking at the yard, not at her. "I've been thinking that a man who had something worth coming back to would find that kind of arrangement practical." Belle set her boot down and looked at the side of his face. His jaw was set and his eyes were on the middle distance, and she could see that he had been working up to this for longer than this afternoon. "Walter," she said. He turned to look at her. "Are you telling me you want to stay in Caldwell," she said, "or are you telling me something else?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm telling you something else. I'm saying it badly because I have not had a great deal of practice saying things like this, but I'm saying it, and I want to say it plainly because I think you deserve plainness." He took a breath. "I think about this place the whole time I'm away from it. I think about you the whole time I'm away from it. I wake up in the morning on the road, and my first thought is about something I should tell you or something I think you'd find interesting or something I want to ask you. And when I come here I feel," he stopped. Looked for the word, "like I've arrived somewhere, not just a place, somewhere." Belle looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was doing its gold and green business, and Clara had given up chasing the chicken and was now sitting in the mud with intense concentration, which would need to be dealt with shortly. The creek was running, a sound she could hear from here, the voice of the land coming back to itself. She had not expected to feel this way again. She had not expected that her heart was capable of this particular quality of certainty, which was not the wild, dizzy certainty of youth, but the deep, clear certainty of a woman who had loved well and lost, and had learned the exact weight of what she valued. She knew that she had been feeling this for a while. She knew she had been letting herself feel it slowly and carefully, testing it the way you tested new ice before you trusted your weight to it. And now here she was on her porch steps in March, with the winter finally gone and the land coming back, and Walter Keller was looking at her with gray eyes that were asking something she had been waiting, without admitting it to herself, to be asked. "I think you should stay in Caldwell," she said. Her voice was steady. "And I think you should court me properly. Because I have a daughter and a reputation, and I'm not the sort of woman who does things in a hurry." Walter Keller looked at her, and the smile that came was slow and warm and whole, and it was the best thing she had seen on a human face in a very long time. "I would not ask you to do anything in a hurry," he said. "I have patience, and I'm going to need a place to stable Chester and Earl." She laughed, and the laugh surprised her with how good it felt. "The barn has room," she said. He looked out at the yard, and at the garden plot she had been turning, and at the homestead sitting solid and square on its 160 acres of Kansas grassland, and he said, "This is a good piece of land." "It is," she agreed. He spent that week in Caldwell, seeing to his business arrangements, and he found a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Prout, a stout and cheerful widow who asked him 17 questions about his intentions before she gave him a key. He came to the homestead in the evenings, arriving before supper and leaving by 8 o'clock, with a propriety that satisfied the concerns of anyone who might be watching, which in Caldwell was most people, because Caldwell was a town of 800 souls who collectively considered themselves each other's business. Belle had been acquainted with several of the townswomen from her trips into Caldwell, and the news of Walter's attentions reached the community faster than the spring mud dried. Mrs. Hatch, who ran the post office with her husband and knew everything about everybody, asked Belle directly one afternoon when Belle came for the mail whether it was true she had a gentleman caller. "I have a friend who visits," Belle said, with a composure that she had been practicing. "A friend who visits in a freight wagon and stabled his horses at your place," Mrs. Hatch said, not unkindly but very accurately. "His horses are in my barn, yes," Belle said. "He fixed the east beam last winter." Mrs. Hatch looked at her over the counter with the expression of a woman who had organized too many church socials to be deceived about anything. "He seems like a decent man," she said. "Earl Winslow asked after him at the hardware store and said he had a good reputation in Wichita." "I'm glad to hear it," Belle said. "I'm just saying," Mrs. Hatch said, in the tone of someone who was doing a great deal more than just saying, "that the town would think well of things being done properly." "Things are being done properly," Belle said firmly, and took her mail. The courtship was exactly what she had asked for it to be, which was proper and unhurried, but not cold, not distant, not without the particular electricity that existed between two people who were being careful with something they valued. Walter came in the evenings, and they sat on the porch when the weather allowed, which it increasingly did as April warmed the land, and they talked. He was a man who had thought about many things and had nobody to discuss them with, and she was a woman who had thought about many things for the same reason. And the conversations they had were the kind that built something between two people the way stones build a wall, each one fitting the last, the structure growing without any one stone being remarkable on its own. He told her about his childhood in Illinois, about a father who was a dreamer and a mother who was the practical engine behind every dream the father ever had. He told her about the Nebraska ranching venture, about the cold and the failed crops and his father's stubborn refusal to admit defeat until the last possible moment, and then his sudden, complete capitulation, the way some men were. He told her about the cattle drives, the Kishom Trail in 1872, the combination of boredom and sudden danger that defined that work, the company of men who were rough but often surprisingly decent, and the loneliness of the trail after the fire died down, and there was nothing but stars and the sound of cattle and the sound of your own thoughts. She told him things she had not told anyone since Thomas. About the Ohio farm she had grown up on, and the particular way the light fell through the maple trees in autumn that she had tried to describe to Thomas and to Clara, and had never quite gotten the words right for. About the woman she had expected to become, the neat and settled life she had imagined in Ohio, and how coming west had changed her in ways she was still discovering. About the first year on the homestead and the hard process of learning the land, The mistakes she had made with the garden, the summer the wheat blew flat in a wind storm, and Thomas had sat on the porch with his head in his hands, and she had been the one to say they would try again. About loving him. About the particular texture of his absence, the way grief for a spouse was not only the loss of a person, but the loss of all the small daily patterns they had been part of, the coffee cup in the wrong place, the absence of weight in the bed. Walter listened to all of it. He did not try to fix it or comment on it from a distance. He listened the way that people rarely listened, with his whole attention, and occasionally he said something that showed he had heard not just the surface of what she'd said but the thing underneath it. In April, Clara fell ill with a fever that lasted 5 days and sent Belle into the particular, focused terror of a mother, who has already lost one person she loved and knows the precise weight of what she could lose again. She did not send word to Walter because there was nothing for him to do and she did not want to alarm him, but he came on his usual day and found the house closed up against the cold she was trying to keep out for Clara's sake, and she answered the door looking like a woman who had not slept in 2 days. He took in the situation in approximately 4 seconds. He did not ask what he could do because he could see what needed doing. He went to get Dr. Reeves from town. He came back with Dr. Reeves and a supply of laudanum that the doctor prescribed for Clara's discomfort while the fever ran its course, and then he went to the kitchen and began making broth from the salt pork and the dried vegetables because Belle had forgotten to eat. He sat up with her the second night, the worst night, when Clara's fever spiked and Belle sat beside the cot with a wet cloth and her hand on her daughter's thin back, counting breaths. He sat in the chair by the stove and he was simply there. He did not speak much and did not try to comfort her with words, because he seemed to understand that what she needed was not reassurance but company. He was awake every time she looked over at him, his gray eyes steady in the lamplight, and the presence of him in that room during that night was something she knew she would not forget. The fever broke on the morning of the 3rd day, and Clara opened her eyes and said she was hungry, which was the most welcome thing Belle had ever heard. And Belle put her face in her hands for a moment, and Walter was there with a cup of water and his large hand warm on her shoulder, and she leaned into it for just a moment before she straightened and wiped her face and went to feed her daughter. He went home that morning but was back by afternoon, and when she came out onto the porch he was sitting on the top step with a look on his face that she had not seen before. "Belle," he said. "Walter," she said, settling beside him. "I have been patient," he said, "and I intend to keep being patient for as long as you need. But I want you to know what I am being patient for so that you understand my intentions clearly." He was looking at the yard, the garden which was coming up now, the first green shoots breaking through the soil, the sunflower seeds she had planted along the garden's southern border. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to live here. I want to help you run this place, and I want to be present when Clara wakes up sick in the middle of the night. I want to sit at your table and hear you talk about things, and I want the right to hold your hand when you're frightened." He turned to look at her. "I'm not in a hurry. I know you have things to consider, and I know that you have been doing everything for yourself for a long time, and that asking for anything from anyone does not come naturally to you. So I'm just telling you what I want, and I am going to go back to town now and give you time to think, and you do not need to answer me today or this week or even this month." Belle Baker sat on the porch of her homestead on a warm April afternoon, with the creek running and the garden coming up and her daughter alive and recovering inside, and she looked at Walter Keller's profile as he looked at her yard, and she thought about patience, and about the things that were worth being patient for, and about the way a person arrived in your life sometimes from a completely unexpected direction, and proceeded to make it impossible to imagine the previous arrangement. "Walter," she said. He turned. "I've thought about it," she said. "I've been thinking about it since February." He was very still. "Yes," she said. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at her with a fullness in his expression that she had not seen him allow himself before, something behind the careful, competent exterior that was unguarded and real and a little undone. Then he reached over and took her hand, and the warmth of his hand around hers felt, after the long winter, after all of it, like something arriving that was both new and somehow already known. "I'll speak to Reverend Pearson," he said. "Give me a month," she said. "I want to do this right, and I want the garden up, and I want Clara to have a sunflower to look at when it happens." He looked at the garden. The green shoots were small and brave and definite. 1 month, he agreed. The month was a good month. One of those unexpected gifts that life occasionally provided, where the weather and the circumstances and the internal condition of the people involved all aligned into something worth paying attention to. The spring in Kansas in 1878 was beautiful in the way of hard-won things. The land so grateful to be released from winter that it overproduced in the first warmth. The grass coming in thick and green. The wildflowers pushing up along the creek bank in colors that Clara catalogued with an attention to detail that revealed her mother's character in full. Walter moved his operation to Caldwell formally, arranging to use the livery stable's storage yard for the wagon, and informing his clients in Wichita of the new base of operations. The news was received without much difficulty because Walter's reliability and the quality of his work meant that his clients were more interested in keeping him than in where he kept himself. He set up an agreement with 2 men in Caldwell who would handle local deliveries for him when he was on longer routes, which kept the business running, and began to build something that would eventually be a small freight company of his own. He came to the homestead every morning now, working the land beside Belle in a partnership that was practical and cheerful, and had the quality of something that had been waiting to exist. They plowed the north field together with Chester and Earl, the 2 big draft horses turning out to be more than adequate to the task. Walter had a natural affinity for the work of the land that surprised him, coming as he did from a background of roads and movement, but he found in it the same satisfaction he found in any work well done, and he found the particular pleasure of working beside Belle Baker to be something he could not compare to anything else. Clara had decided that Walter was acceptable at some point in April, and had not made a formal announcement of this, but had simply begun treating him as a fixture, climbing onto his back without invitation when he was on his hands and knees in the garden, requiring his opinion on drawings, and issuing him commands about the chickens with the confidence of a small general who knows her orders will be followed. The wedding was held on a Saturday morning in the last week of May at the Caldwell Community Church, which was a modest building with good windows, and a congregation of mixed denomination that met together, because in a town of 800 people, the various Christian traditions had found a pragmatic unity. Reverend Pearson, who was a quiet and intelligent man who had been in Caldwell since 1873, performed the service with warmth and a satisfying brevity. Belle wore the blue dress that she had made from a length of cloth she had found at Abernathy's store, blue the color of the spring sky, which she had sewn in the evenings of the preceding 3 weeks, with Clara giving opinions about the collar. She had her dark hair up in a way that she had seen illustrated in one of the magazines that came periodically to Caldwell with the mail. She did not think herself particularly handsome, but when she had finished dressing that morning and looked in the small mirror above the washstand, she had felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who had done what she could and was content with the result. Walter stood at the front of the church in a dark coat she had not seen before, which had clearly been purchased in Wichita for the occasion, and when she came down the aisle he looked at her with an expression that told her everything she needed to know about how she looked. Mrs. Hatch was there, and the Abernathy family, and the Pruitts, and Dr. Reeves, and a collection of townspeople who had collectively decided that Belle Baker was one of their own, and her wedding was therefore a community event. Clara sat in the front pew between Mrs. Pruitt and Mrs. Hatch and wore her best dress, which was yellow, and held a small bunch of wildflowers that Walter had picked for her from the creek bank that morning, which she treated as her personal wedding bouquet. When Reverend Pearson said the words that needed saying, and Walter put a plain gold ring on Belle's finger, a ring that he had chosen with care, and that fit her hand as if it had been made for it, she felt the ceremony of it move through her in a way she had not expected. She had thought she might feel the shadow of her first wedding in the proceedings, the way that second things sometimes carry the ghost of first things. But what she felt was entirely its own, entire and specific to this moment, and this man and this version of herself that had been built in part by everything that had come before and was nonetheless new. She looked at Walter Keller standing beside her in the Caldwell church, and he looked at her, and in his gray eyes she saw the same thing she felt, the recognition of something arrived at, something earned. They kissed to the cheerful approval of the congregation, and Clara said loudly from the front pew, "Now he can eat dinner every day," which produced a laughter that carried them out of the church and into the May sunshine. The summer that followed was the busiest and best that Belle had known on the homestead. With Walter's income from the freight operation supplementing the farm's production, they were able to make improvements that had been waiting for years. A second room was added to the house, the room that Belle and Thomas had talked about in that good autumn years ago, now finally built with Walter's practical skill and the labor of 2 men from town he hired for the heavier work. It was a proper bedroom, which gave Clara her own space for the first time and gave Belle and Walter a privacy that the single-room arrangement had entirely precluded. The garden was extraordinary that year. The sunflowers that Mrs. Alderman's seeds had produced stood along the southern border of the garden in a row of cheerful enormity, their faces tipped toward the sun with an optimism that Clara visited every morning to verify. She had named each one, a fact she reported to Walter with the expectation that he would remember the names, which he did, and which Belle thought was one of the truest measures of his character. They worked the 160 acres together with the energy of 2 people who had found their rhythm, and the energy was different from what Belle had known alone, not doubled but multiplied, the way that genuine partnership multiplied things. Walter had ideas about the land that she had not thought of, and she had knowledge of the land that he lacked, and the exchange between these 2 things produced decisions that were better than either of them would have made alone. He was not Thomas. She had not wanted him to be, and he was not. He was himself, completely and without apology, with his own ways of thinking and his own habits and his own history. And the life they built together was its own thing, not a continuation of the first marriage but a new construction on ground that had been earned by what came before. She thought about Thomas sometimes, with the love and grief that did not go away but changed in character over time, becoming less like an open wound and more like a scar that you touched sometimes and remembered, and then went back to the present with. She thought Walter understood this, because he never seemed threatened by it, and never seemed to require her to perform a completeness she did not feel. One evening in August they sat on the porch after Clara was in bed, the summer dark coming down warm and full of stars, the kind of Kansas night that made up for the winters. A mockingbird was doing its long, complicated performance in the cottonwoods by the creek, and the sound of the water under it was the summer version of the winter sound, the same creek, a different voice. Walter had his arm around her and she had her head against his shoulder, and they had been sitting in comfortable silence for a while, which was a silence they had earned. "I used to think I didn't want to stay anywhere," he said. "I know," she said. "I was wrong about that," he said. "I think what I didn't want was to stay somewhere that didn't mean anything. There's a difference." She turned her head to look up at him. His profile was against the stars, the familiar lines of his face that had become as known to her as her own hands. "It means something," she said. "Everything," he said. Quietly, certainly, the way he said things when he was most sure of them. She reached up and touched his face, and he turned to look at her, and they kissed in the warm summer dark, while the mockingbird sang its whole catalog. And it was one of those moments that a person carries for the rest of their life as evidence that things can be as good as the best version of them. In the autumn, Belle discovered she was expecting a child. She told Walter on a Sunday morning in October while Clara was outside conducting an investigation of the garden's end-of-season state, and his face in the moment after she told him was a thing she would remember clearly forever. He was very still for just a breath, and then he stood from the table and came around to her and held her with the kind of careful, complete embrace that said more than any collection of words could have. "When?" he said into her hair. "Late April," she said. "Early May." He pulled back to look at her face, both hands on her shoulders, and the expression he wore was one she had not seen on any face in her memory, not on her father's face when she was born, not on Thomas's face when Clara arrived, because this was Walter's expression and it was his own. A combination of wonder and a very serious kind of happiness and something that might have been, underneath it all, relief. The relief of a man who had been moving for a long time and had finally arrived somewhere he wanted to stay. "I'm going to need to expand the barn," he said. She burst out laughing and he laughed with her, and Clara came in through the door to find them laughing and said, "What?" in a tone of complete and urgent demand, and they told her she was going to have a brother or a sister, and her response was a pause of absolute silence followed by, "I want a sister," followed immediately by, "but a brother would be acceptable if he was good at listening." The winter of 1878 to 1879 was cold but not cruel. Not in the way the previous winter had been, not in the way that stripped the world down to its essentials and asked you to survive them. It was the ordinary kind of Kansas cold, the kind that tested you without punishing you, and they met it as a household with a full wood pile, a well-stocked larder, 2 capable adults, 1 very opinionated child, and the particular warmth of a house in which people were glad to be. Walter continued the freight operation through the winter, adjusting his routes to the weather with the experienced judgment of a man who had been reading winter roads for years. And when the routes were impossible, he was home, and the days he was home were the best days. He had a way of filling a house without crowding it, a presence that was substantial but never imposing, and Belle, who had been alone long enough to know the exact quality of that aloneness, found his presence daily and specifically good. Clara, in the way of children who were given love and security, bloomed. She became chattier than ever, which had not seemed possible, and she took to following Walter around with a commentary on whatever he was doing that he received with the unfailing patience and interest that she had come to depend on. She was learning her letters, which Belle taught her in the mornings at the table with a slate and chalk, and she showed Walter her progress each evening with the pride of a person sharing a significant accomplishment. He would examine each letter with appropriate seriousness and make exactly the right response, which was to find something specific to praise and then identify the next challenge. And this method proved so effective that Clara was spelling simple words by Christmas. Christmas itself was the kind of Christmas that people in hard circumstances make when they have resolved to make it good. Belle had saved dried fruit from the autumn and made a cake with it, the best she had made in years, rich with the taste of preserved summer. Walter had brought back from a Wichita run a small collection of items he had assembled with obvious care, a book of illustrated stories for Clara, who received it with the reverence of someone receiving a sacred text, a length of soft wool in a dark red color that Belle had admired in a shop window during one of her own trips to Caldwell, and for the house, a glass oil lamp that was far more beautiful than the one they had been using, casting a warm amber light that made the room feel different in the evening. He had not made a production of the gifts, setting them out in the morning before Clara woke with the quiet practicality of a man who did not know how to be theatrical but knew how to be thoughtful. Belle had stood looking at the lamp in the morning light and felt gratitude and love mixed together in a way that seemed to her to be the particular quality of real happiness, as opposed to the bright, uncomplicated happiness of good fortune. The new year came in cold and clear, and Belle stood on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders and her belly becoming visible now under her clothes. And she looked at the land that was hers and had been Thomas's and was now also Walter's and would belong to all of them and whoever came after. And she felt the weight of a full year behind her and the promise of the spring ahead. And she thought about the previous February, the wood pile she had been counting, the gray sky that would not break. She thought about hearing the wagon on the road and watching a man in a heavy coat driving 2 draft horses toward her gate. She had been running out of winter, and she had not been running out of hope, not quite, not entirely, though it had been a close thing. And he had arrived with a wagon load of both, which was exactly what had happened. Winter ended and hope replenished, though not in the sequence she would have arranged if she had been the one arranging things. Walter came out behind her, a cup of coffee in each hand, and stood beside her. "Cold," he said. "New year," she said. He handed her one of the cups and stood looking at the land with her. The night was very clear and the stars were out in the particular profusion that winter nights in Kansas produced, more stars than you thought possible, a sky that made the world seem very large and the individual life very small, but not in a lonely way, in the way of perspective. "I've been thinking about the North Field," he said. "I know," she said. "Wheat again or corn?" "Corn," he said. "Chester and Earl would need less rest time between passes if we did corn. And with the baby coming in the spring, I'd rather have a crop that doesn't require as much of me in June." This was the kind of practical tenderness that was Walter's particular language, planning a crop schedule around the timing of a birth, because he wanted to be home when it happened. She leaned into his arm. "Corn," she agreed. The baby came on the 10th of May, a boy, and his arrival was preceded by 11 hours of labor that Walter spent in the kitchen in a state of barely managed tension, while Mrs. Hatch and Mrs. Prout and Dr. Reeves attended to Belle in the bedroom. Clara sat with Walter at the kitchen table, and they played a card game that Clara had invented with rules that she changed whenever she was losing, and Walter tolerated this without complaint, which was either love or distraction or both. When Dr. Reeves came out and said that Belle was well and the boy was healthy and strong, Walter stood up from the table, and the expression on his face made Mrs. Hatch, who had seen a great deal in her years in Caldwell, press her handkerchief briefly to her eyes. Belle was lying in the bed, tired in a way that went all the way down, with the boy in her arms. He was red-faced and entirely certain of his own existence in the way of newborns, with dark hair that was clearly going to be his father's and large hands that the women had all remarked on. Walter came in quietly and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son for a long time without saying anything. Clara was beside him, standing on her toes to see over the edge, having been informed in the kitchen that she had gotten a brother, and had responded with, "Well, I hope he is good at listening." "What do you want to name him?" Belle asked. Walter considered the baby. "Thomas," he said. She looked at him. "If that's all right," he said. He met her eyes, and in his there was the understanding of everything he was offering with the name. Not an erasure, but an honoring. A new Thomas for the land that the first Thomas had built. Belle looked down at her son and then back at Walter and felt the completeness of things, the way a good ending felt not like a conclusion but like a beginning that had been properly prepared for. "Thomas Walter Keller," she said. Walter touched his son's small hand, and Thomas wrapped his fingers around Walter's index finger with the grip of someone who intended to hold on. "Hello," Walter said quietly to his son. Clara climbed up onto the bed on the other side of her mother and looked at Thomas with the serious, evaluating gaze she brought to all new situations. "He's small," she said. "He'll grow," Walter said. "He'd better," Clara said. "I have a lot to teach him." Belle laughed, and even in her exhaustion the laugh was whole, and Walter looked at her over the heads of their children with gray eyes that were everything she had come to know in them, steady and warm and entirely present, and she looked back at him with everything she was, and everything she had become, and everything she intended to be. And between them in that room on a May morning, with the creek running and the sunflowers coming up in the garden and the Kansas sky doing its best, It was enough. It was more than enough. It was all of it. The years that followed built on this foundation the way good years do, each one adding something to what had come before. Walter's freight operation grew steadily, and he brought on a third man in 1881, expanding the routes into the territories that were opening as the railroad brought more settlement and more commerce. He bought a second wagon, a smaller one for local deliveries, and trained the two men who worked for him with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything. The homestead expanded too, another room added onto the house in 1882, and a proper cellar for storage that they dug and lined together in the summer, both of them coming up out of it at the end of each work day covered in Kansas dirt and cheerful about it. Belle started a kitchen garden that became, over the years, a genuine enterprise, selling preserved goods and fresh vegetables to several of the families in Caldwell and to the hotel that opened in 1881. The sunflowers remained a constant presence, reseeded each year, standing along the garden's southern border like a standing committee of optimism. Thomas grew into a boy of intense curiosity and almost frightening physical energy, dark-haired like his father, with Belle's stubborn chin and eyes that combined their parents' colors into something between gray and brown that shifted with the light. He took his first steps in June of 1880, fell down 16 times that day, and got up 17. He was talking in full sentences by 18 months and had opinions about the horses by 2 years old. Clara remained Clara, which was to say a force of specific gravity in the family's life, opinionated and organized and deeply loving in the way of people who expressed love through attentiveness and management. She took her responsibility as Thomas's older sister with an earnestness that occasionally exhausted him and always protected him. And the love between them was the argumentative, devoted kind that was the best kind between siblings. In the summer of 1883, Belle and Walter had their second child together, another boy, whom they named James after Walter's father, and who arrived with a quieter temperament than either of his siblings, and a tendency to sit and observe situations before participating in them, which made him seem, in infancy, like a very small philosopher. The Caldwell that Belle had been living 4 miles from when the story began had changed considerably by then. The cattle drives had brought commerce and also trouble to the town through the late 70s and early 80s, and the town had done what frontier towns did, which was absorb the trouble and survive it and gradually become more settled. There had been violence in those years, the kind that was inseparable from the cattle trade and the combination of cash and guns and men, a long way from anything they answered to. Belle was aware of it. Everyone in the county was aware of it, and she did not pretend it was not happening. Walter was careful about when he was in town on the wild nights and kept himself, as he put it, out of other people's troubles, which was wise. He was not a man who carried a gun as a habit, though he kept one on the wagon for the road, and he navigated the rougher currents of Caldwell's cattle trade years with the combination of good judgment and good manners that kept most sensible men out of the worst of things. The town's progress toward order was real and largely accomplished by 1882, when the cattle drives moved to the railheads further west and Caldwell settled into the more ordinary commerce of a frontier agricultural town. The injustice of those years, Belle had come to understand, was not only the violence of the trade, but the way it had ground down the people who were already most vulnerable. She had watched the way the few families of color in the county were treated with a harshness that had nothing to do with anything except the prejudice that the settlers had carried west with them from east of the Mississippi, as if the geography of the frontier were supposed to be an opportunity for everyone, but had been sorted so that it remained an opportunity primarily for those who had always had the most. She and Walter talked about this. He had seen enough of the territories to understand that the expansion of American settlement had costs that were paid by people who had not agreed to pay them. The displacement of the Kiowa and the Comanche, and the other nations whose land this had been before it was Kansas, before it was homesteaded, before it was sold at auction by a government that had decided it could sell what it had already taken. These were large and terrible facts that did not have easy resolutions, and Belle, who was a practical woman, understood that naming a thing truly was not the same as fixing it, but was a necessary prior step, and she raised Clara and Thomas and James with the understanding that the world's injustices were not abstract, that real people bore them, and that a good person did not look away. But the life on the homestead was the life that it was, specific and daily and full of the particular texture of people who know each other completely. Walter came home from his roots, and the house was full again. Belle came in from the garden, and the kitchen smelled of something cooking. Clara grew into a young woman of 14 in 1883 who had strong views about education and had informed her parents that she intended to be a schoolteacher, a plan they supported entirely. Thomas was 5 and commanding. James was a toddler of profound calm. The 160 acres were producing well. Chester and Earl were aging but still working. The barn was standing with its repaired east beam, strong as any part of the structure. On an evening in September of 1883, Walter and Belle sat on the porch in the early fall dark, the air beginning to have its first cool edge, the leaves on the cottonwoods not yet turned but on their way. The children were in bed. The freight business books were done for the month. The garden was in its last productive weeks before frost. The wood pile, which Walter had been building all summer, was stacked so high that Clara had made a drawing of it and titled the drawing, "The Mountain." Belle had been reading, or trying to, but the evening was too beautiful for looking down at a page, and she had set the book aside and was watching the way the last light fell across the yard, the deep, slanted gold of September that she thought was the most beautiful light of the year. "I keep meaning to write to Mrs. Alderman," she said, "about the sunflowers." "She'd like that," Walter said. "I saw her last month in Wichita." "She asked after you." Belle looked at him. "You told her about us." "I told her the first winter I came back from here," he said. "She asked why I seemed different. I told her I'd stopped in at a homestead south of Caldwell and met a woman who had single-handedly kept a farm going through the worst winter in memory and refused to call it anything remarkable." Belle was quiet for a moment, thinking about a February morning and a wagon on a frozen road and a man looking down at her with cold-reddened cheeks and asking if the road had washed out. "I was running out of wood," she said. "You were not running out of much else," he said. She turned to look at him, her husband, this man who had driven into her life on a wagon load of cord wood and canned goods in the clean, practical force of his own decency, and had proceeded to be, in every way she could measure and some she could not, the right person for the life she was building. "Walter," she said. He said. He was watching a nighthawk work the darkening sky above the north field, its angular shape moving against the first stars. "I'm glad the road north was closed," she said. He looked at her then, and his smile was the full, easy one she had come to know the way she knew her own reflection, and he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his thumb moving across her knuckles in the small, unconscious gesture of affection that had become so habitual that she noticed its absence more than its presence. "So am I," he said. The September night deepened around them. The cottonwoods rustled their ending summer leaves. The creek carried its conversation across the dark land. Inside the house, Clara was reading past her bedtime. They both knew it and were letting it go, because it was a night for letting small things go. Thomas was asleep with the absolute completeness of a 5-year-old who had used all of himself through the day. James was quiet in his crib with the serenity of a child who had decided early that the world was probably all right. Belle Baker Keller sat on the porch of the homestead that she had held through the worst winter of her life, on the land that she had refused to leave, beside the man who had arrived on a frozen road with cord wood and canned peaches, and a capacity for work and honesty that had proven to be exactly what she had needed, and also, it turned out, everything she had wanted. She held his hand in the dark. She felt the complete, accomplished piece of a life that had been fought for and built, and was, on this September evening, exactly what it was supposed to be. The stars came out fully over the Kansas grassland, more stars than the world seemed large enough to contain, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a mockingbird, either the same one or a descendant, began its long and various song, singing all the other birds at once, which was its gift and its habit and perhaps also its way of saying that the world, despite everything, despite all its cold winters and its losses and its long roads, was large enough for this, for two people on a porch, for a family asleep inside, for 160 acres of tended land under a sky full of September stars. It was all of it, and it was enough, and they held it together.